giving a talk about advanced CSS. I guess most of you already know me, but for the people in the streaming channel, I am currently working at Toptal as a front-end developer. But I've been lucky enough, like, for doing CSS for 4 years, almost exclusively. After that, I become much more a front-end developer. I am right now doing any sort of front-end project, but I always feel like the presentation layer is where I'm more comfortable with. So in this talk, we are going to be solving a couple of issues. I mean, understanding a couple of technologies, not new technologies. So we are going to start with classic layout techniques, which is what you've been doing so far. Then we're going to move to a couple of very minor improvements added by CSS3. After, we are going to see Flexbox, which is what I think is the most important topic for this talk. I found it really interesting and easy to work with. So it's what we are going to be focusing the most. Then we're going to be seeing grid layout, which is something really new, and you are not going to be using this right now, but it's very good to have an idea of what is coming next. And the last topic is post-CSS. If no one of you heard about it, this is some sort of CSS post-processor, which is people is talking a lot about, because it's much more similar to what people is doing in the new trends like React and a couple of other things, which is making CSS more JS friendly. So as I mentioned before, classic CSS is what we've been doing before, since, I don't know, 15 years ago. It's what we do all the time. We've been using floats, clear fixed position width with insane numbers, doing inline blocks, and doing that kind of things that you are usually seeing in CSS. So this is what we're going to be doing now. What I want you to see and understand is how we can do CSS, classic CSS, but then solve a lot of problems with Flexbox, and for you to understand the difference and why we need that sort of technologies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start working now in the code. So I'm going to build an example, which I think I have in the next slide. This is what I'm going to be working with. It's pretty simple. It's similar to what I wrote on my Toptal article. I don't know if any of you read it, but then I'm going to share the link. This is much simpler than that. The idea is first we are going to tackle this layout, which is straightforward. Then we're going to do this, add some complexity, and these other two examples are also hard to accomplish with classic CSS. It can be done, but the idea is with this we can illustrate how easy it is to solve the same problems with new technologies. Okay. So I have a project here. You can see it's a very simple project. I used it good because it's very easy to work with. It allows me to basically add different plugins that I can use to convert CSS or whatever, and also to be able to watch. So right now I'm watching the CSS and building the output here, and this is my source. I also have a very, very, very basic HTML. What I want you to focus is it's just in what we are talking about, not anything else, so I keep it to the barely minimum. And the idea is that we are going to work on this. So I am going to call it a basket. And inside the basket, I am going to place fruits. Okay? So it's just an arrangement. And I'm going to add 3 fruits. To make it easy to remember, I am going to call these fruits, let me see the colors, so red, orange, and green. This might sound redundant, but orange, the fruit, not the color.
UVCR.
What?
It says food, not fruit. UVCR.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So if we now load the page, we're going to see basically nothing. Let me find it. This is what we were expecting to see because we haven't yet added any CSS, but we do have the HTML here. So now I'm going to start writing the CSS. Can he here? I'm going to place. Let's take a look on how should it looks. So we have the basket is like gray background, has a gray background, and some sort of padding here. So I'm going to add that. So now our CSS looks the same because as I mentioned before, I have a gulp task building automatically this. So I'm also going to add how a fruit should look, like a basic style for a fruit. So this is, sorry, if I know this is very basic, but we're going to be like adding more complex stuff. So I want you to understand how the process to go to a Flexbox is. So we have our basket. We should have our fruits, but they are the same color, so actually they are transparent, so we cannot see them. Oops. Oh. No, we see the basket as we were expecting. They are just appear in the DOM as following the order in they appear. It's just basic. Okay. Nothing fancy right now. So if we want to do this arrangement, the first one I show you with classic CSS, we have a couple of alternatives. The more classical one would be like just floating left every fruit, which is just one line of code apparently. It basically worked. We have one problem, which I guess you all know. Who can tell me what's going on here?
The problem is the height of the container is 0 because all the elements are floating, so we need to clear the floats by probably adding some before and after component with clear.
So this is one of, something I did not mention is that CSS originally was not intended for doing this sort of complex layout. It's just the float property was like for moving images around text, and the developers realized that they can do complex stuff other than using tables, using the float property. But so this ended up being a bug, which has a solution with CSS. So if you see code wrote in the, starting the like 10 years ago, you'll see that people used to do like this sort of fixes, or probably we can save some code. This is the famous Claire fix. People were doing this like, if anyone who worked at 10 years ago in web will see this fix for the Claire. It works.
Actually, there were a lot of people using VRs for that breadline.
HR? Yeah. I've seen this in a variety of flavors over the last 10 years. But right now, this is still a problem. If you are doing classic CSS, you will have this issue. Is just how classic CSS works. One of the most common solution is like doing a micro Claire fix. I'm not sure if I'm going to remember this properly. So I'm going to just add the fix. But this should also work, or not?
Try with the after.
Yeah, sorry. That's it. So I just did the same. I used the after pseudo element from CSS3, which basically adds a virtual element into DOM. So I make it. If you see here, you can see this is the pseudo element. And I have applied the display block first, just a basic content, and the same as I did with the div tag, I added a Claire property. So that makes the trick. This is very classic and basic CSS. So now let's get it complex with trying to solve this issue. So we have just floated an element. So there is no way that we can achieve that sort of layout and having this like being some sort of responsive if we have this floated. So one of the first ideas that came up to solve this problem is like converting this, and instead of using floats is doing this like with display block value for the display property. Okay? So what I'm going to do, this is something that I won't probably need anymore. And what I'm going to do is remove the float. So this should look like vertically as before. But I'm going to change now. I'm going to make all fruits to have a different display property. We have the same issue. I mean, it's looking the same. I'm going to show you one advantage of this sort of layout. So one comment about this, you can see that now we have like a 1 pixel between all of them. This is because we make this look inline block, and inline elements behave basically like text. So there is one fix which is not going to work here, just because I am using the EM. This is also something I wanted to show you. I am using the EM unit, which refers to the actual font size of the element. So to fix this, I need to make probably there is other solution. This is the one I had in the top of my head now. So I can make all fruits to have a font size of 0, which this is why I mentioned it's not going to work, because we have a reference to the font size which is 0. So it makes no sense. So what I can do is like change the width to something different, like.
Could you make this inspector bigger, a little bigger?
Yes, please.
Yes.
What? Just make this chapter bigger.
Zoom the
Font size.
How do I? Okay.
Thank you.
This is new for me. So what I'm doing is changing the font to instead of EM using PX. It didn't work. No, I think it's sorry. Actually, it's here. I think so. So it works. So yeah.
For compressed code, it will behave the same way. The problem is the jump in between the tags. When we write the code, it adds the space. But if the code were compressed, the space wouldn't be there. So it's
Right.
more
Yeah, that's also a fix.
production.
This is yeah, you're right. This is a fix using CSS, but as he mentioned, there are different fixes. One of them is like doing this. Oops. Right? This should also work.
Cool.
Which, yeah, I mean, it's
I mean, totally.
yeah. I like it more the CSS solution, but I have seen this. Some people doing this in situations like when you cannot change the font size of the parent element. Okay, this is just something epic I wanted to show you. So we changed it to be inline blocks because we wanted to have this centered to mimic this layout. I'm pretty sure we cannot achieve this with inline block, but let's try it. So what I'm thinking now is that this is an inline block element, so it should respond to the text align property because it's a mix of an inline and a block. So we can try that. We are almost there, but not there yet, right? So we have the orange. We have the orange in the center, but we wanted the red and the apple and the kiwi. We wanted them to be like in the borders. So we cannot do this way. But I wanted to see the inline block because it gives you power in other aspects of the layout. So for instance, if we shrink the page, you can see that this element is also centered. This is something that in some layout situations we can take advantage of. There are a lot of situations this is pretty useful. So it's also sort of responsive. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to keep this. I'm going to keep this property. I'm going to add to the code. And now, in order to achieve this layout, I am going to do a mix between the float and the inline, and I'm going to add to apple, which is what I want to the left, I'm going to float, and to kiwi, I'm going to do and there you go. So I ended up using a mix of all of the techniques. Hello? This works, but if you shrink the page, you will notice that it breaks. So it's sort of a solution. We can achieve responsiveness and like adding media queries to this. So after we see it breaks, we add a media query and we sort this differently, which we will need to like write a lot of more code. But it's what it is. I mean, people have been doing this for, as I mentioned before, 15 years, and it works. The web works. So. Okay, so let's take a look to the other problem and see how we can solve this with classical CSS. So this is a bit more complex. We can try to reuse what we have and go from there. So we are almost there with this. But CSS 2.1 has the problem that space is not something that elements are aware of. So an element does not know when there is more available space. So they just know the properties that they have attached to themselves, and they like behave in context with the other elements. When they have no more space, they start doing these sort of things. They don't use the free space. So for solving this, there are a couple of alternatives. If we don't have CSS3, then it's complex, because in this particular case we have fixed width elements. So the fruits have a fixed width, and we have an unknown amount of free space here, because we can change the viewport. So we cannot use a percentage. So let me show you that. If I set it this instead of a fixed width, I have 3 elements. My first idea is like supposing that everyone can take 33%, right? Okay, this works, but it's not what we wanted to do. We wanted to have 2 fixed elements and 1 using the available space. So let's keep it how it was before. And let's take a look to our orange. So same as before, to illustrate the problem, if we set a width here, just for this particular element, not for every fruit, to like 66%, it doesn't work. It might work in just this particular case, which it was pure coincidence, but it starts to break, right? So this is a problem that there is another solution using a CSS expansion that will require us to use position absolute for this. I can illustrate this. I don't want to go too farther from the subject. Let me do this very quickly before we go to CSS trees, and I can illustrate you how it works with new techniques. So I'll need to first set a position relative to this element to be a reference for the inner elements. Then I'm going to set this let me do the code here. As you can see, we again have the same problem of the clear fix, which I already explained. That's because I commented this code. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I made this element be position absolute. So I'm going to set a left equal to, I think it should be 10 em. This will be like next to the first block. And a right. And let's see how it goes. So it should work, but it doesn't work just because we have a width or fruit or generic fruit class has a width. So I will have to override that class, that property here. And it works. So we achieved something sort of complex for CSS, classic CSS. It works, it's cross-browser. We can use this wherever we want. It's like CSS that we've been writing for 15 years, so you can trust this. So let me just make this call. And there you go. Okay. So the last of the arrangements that we wanted to achieve is like something like what we had before, but with the ability to expand vertically. This is not complex, but let's see how it works. So we had this element here, or basket, it doesn't have a fixed width, height. I'm going to make it bigger to illustrate. Oops. So just for this case, we can change the height of our fruit. Instead of having a fixed height, we can make it have a relative height. So this one doesn't work because we have the position absolute, which breaks something different. But let's remove that. So let's go back to our example, and we will have that's straightforward. So any questions? Comments? This is like the very basic of CSS layout. If you understand this, you can do basically whatever you want and have it working on every browser. So let's go back to our slides. Oh, I forgot about this one. So these complex things that I mentioned you, that we can do CSS expansion using the position property, position relative to the parent, position absolute to the child, and use left and right, so we expand. We can achieve basically the same, but in a much more simpler way if we use the CSS calc function. This allows us to use a computed value for depending on the browser conditions for a property, which is an interesting idea and something useful that you can basically use right now also. It doesn't have the compatibility of the other properties we saw, but it works. So we are going to change our orange CSS, and instead of having a fixed width, we're going to use the calc function, and we're going to say we want this to have 100% minus the width of both of the elements. So it will be 20 ems. So this is, yeah, I see. There you go. So with just one line of code, we had to write like 5 properties before. With this one only property, we can achieve the same. And it also works vertically, and you can use this in another CSS property, not only for width. You can use it wherever a unit is needed.
And also, if the element grows, it pushes off the box, the container, the base.
Yeah. So to make this, you see, this is something I just realized, is that this breaks. So we can fix it very easily, like adding a, hopefully this will work. Oh, it's still broken, but but it's still visible, right? If we don't do this, like if you have elements here, they're going to broke even badly. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. This is what I mentioned before. So as recapping all these classic CSS, this is all we're going to talk about, classical techniques. This is, I mean, CSS3 improved some things, but this is still bad. Like for a presentation language, if you compare this with any other presentation, like what would you have in Java or any other language, it's very basic. As I mentioned before, it's something that the developers came up with. It's what it was not designed for this purpose, and so it's bad. It still sucks. This is the compatibility table for the calc function. You can see that as usual, I'm not sure, I think I pasted the wrong one. Let me double check. Yeah, no, yeah, it was the wrong paste. So you can use this starting on IA9. Other browsers seem to have pretty good compatibility other than Opera, and this is, Android might be a problem because we see that 4.3 does not support it, so this can be a very drawback to using this property. I think this one is the Flexbox. I probably copy-paste wrong. Oh yeah. Was my mistake. I move 2 slides. Okay, so we are going to talk about Flexbox now. This came out like about 5 years ago or something like that. I don't remember exactly the year, but it was about when CSS3, and it's also considered in that big box that we call CSS3. People used to put this inside that. But it's a different draft. It's basically a new box model, something not related to the classical box model. It allows us to, it adds a lot of new properties for layouting elements. When I started to dig into this, I already have a way to make layouts. So I thought that it doesn't make any sense. But then when I learned to do this, I realized that I was wasting a lot of time in making floats and moving things around. This is much easier once you get used to all those properties. And even though that most browsers doesn't have full support yet, and it has a bunch of well-known bugs, I can tell that you can always have a project where to use this. The project I'm working right now doesn't, but the one I worked before, it was like a Cordova app for iOS, and it worked perfectly. I saved a lot of times using Flexbox instead of basic layouts. So whenever you start a new project, I recommend you to make sure that you can use this if you can. If they don't need to support like we have here, IA lower than 10, then you should go with Flexbox. Okay. So again, we are going to be working on the same problem. So we again illustrate what the challenge is. So I'm going to comment this code out. So because later I'm going to publish this for anyone willing to. Let's do something. So okay, I just cleared the the exercise, and we should see this as it was. Yeah, this is just no CSS basically for positioning. And we are going to start using Flexbox just by defining, adding the flex value to the display property. This will define a flex container. This is just terminology, but it's important to know that once we define some element as a flex, every contained item is going to be automatically become a flex item with a default flex property. So that's important because once you define a container, the content is not going to behave like you are used to. It's going to be different. So we define a flex container and we say we want this to display as flex. This is a new value added to the existing property, which is display. And let's see what happens. It's basically what we have on our, oops, not this. So the first example is straightforward. It's covered by just by all the default properties. Let's take a look on how to solve the second part. So if any of you work with CSS, you know that you have to learn a lot of properties. You usually forget them. For this particular example, I found this cheat sheet, which is very good because it drives you in a way that it makes you understand how property works. Then I'm going to share this. It's very good because you have visual example of what each property and on where those properties are. And I am just remembering. So to solve the second exercise, we can use the justify content. Basically the same. It's not the same. This is more similar to what we did with the inline. You see that it's not like keeping the same space here, but we have another property. This is the complex part of Flexbox. You have to learn it's like 10 new properties and about 15 new values. Yes?
So this is part of CSS by default, or you have to include some libraries?
No. This is part of CSS.
From what version? From 3 version?
It's not part of CSS 3, but it's a separate draft that is, at the beginning, as I mentioned before, I didn't thought that this was going to get popular. It didn't look like. But after a couple of years, browsers started to implement it, and right now you have this sort of support, which I showed you before, I think. Yes, this is the compatibility table for Flexbox. So when I see this box, I would say that this is part of CSS, and you can use it basically right now. Other than IA, which does have a lot of market share, but not that much lately. But despite that, there are a lot of scenarios where you can actually use this, because not every project requires IA.
Bootstrap 4 is Flexbox by default, and you can turn it off with SAS variable.
Cool. I didn't know that. Nice. So yeah, CSS is something you can use right now. And so we wanted to make this like the example. So I'm just going to change one property, and this is going to work. I just changed the space around, which assigns the free space around the elements to make a space between, so it just works. So this is what happened. This is what I told you before, that it makes you save a lot of time. I don't know how much technique. It's 3 minutes. This is very complex to do with CSS, and you have to know a lot of CSS to accomplish this. So let's save this. So now let's see the other layout we want to achieve. Let's see this example here. So we want the orange to occupy all the free space. This is what makes CSS a very important draft for the current times, because CSS understands the idea of available space. So elements having the flex properties will use this according to proportions. So we can set to different elements how much of the free space we want them to use. And I'm going to show you that right now. So we already see we can have the display flex, which defines a container for us. What we did not see is how we define a flex item, which are the items inside of the container. I did not show you this before because, as I mentioned, Flexbox automatically sets a default value for the container items, but we can override that. So for our fruit orange, I am going to use the flex property. And the flex property is a shorthand of 3 other properties, which are flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. Basically, these 3 properties control how we want the element to use the free space. So the first property, flex grow, we're going to place 1. Sorry, not for this. It's only for orange. We are going to change this only for orange. So I'm going to change the field property to 1. Okay. And so what I did here is I say to this item, I want you to use like a proportion of 1 of the available space. As I'm here, this is the only element with 1 property is going to use all the available space. Because by default, all elements came this way. This is the default value. So every element is, we are telling to every element that we do not want them to use free space. Just use the space that they define, like with their width. But here I'm going to change this property to 1. So I want this to use all the space. Let me place 0 here to illustrate something. And this is the basis. The basis is the minimum width, like before the available space is assigned between all the elements, the width we set here is what we want the item to use. For now, we are going to use out.
It's like the calc.
No. You can think of this like a fixed width. So to illustrate it, let's change.
Is it applied for height as well?
Let's.
For height?
Yes, I'm going to show you that. See, we are going to go together. Thank you, because I forgot. So I'm going to make auto the width. We have a width of 10 em. I'm going to make it auto just to illustrate this. So this auto property. So for this case, the space, I mean, this configuration of the flex property, even though we have a basis of 10, it is still going to use the free space. But if we so in this case, it behaves, the auto property here for the flex basis behaves same as having a width, a defined width. Sorry if I'm confusing you guys with this. I know it requires some time to understand Flexbox because it's a whole new thing, but trust me, it's much more easy than what it looks.
What happens if you set up max width?
It works. So for instance, 20 ems.
That's a flex one.
So his question is, yeah, CSS classic properties still works. There are a couple of bugs registered to the flexbox, mostly in Chrome for when working with max height particularly. But we are not going to cover those here. So I lost, so let me. So this is the second. And now let's make our container bigger. So now for solving this problem, again, we are going to just have to add one property, which is one property that allows us to control how the item behaves in the perpendicular axis to the one we are laying out the elements. We shall see this layout, which is column layout, but I'm going to show you the other one just in a moment. So the align items property can take a couple of properties. This is also really interesting. We cannot achieve this with classic CSS. This is vertical centering. I guess all of you were like suffering for years trying to solve this.
Yes.
And this is straightforward with CSS. All this sort of centering. Before we were doing like stupid things like inline elements and vertical lines and crazy. So actually the property I'm going to use is the stretch. And it doesn't work, but it doesn't work because we have defined a fixed height for the elements. So we remove that and it works. So this way we solve the same problems we were solving with the classic techniques in a much more scalable way. Regardless of what we put inside the container, it's going to work. It also has a lot more features like I showed you before, centering and that sort of things. It is also responsive, and even though that we need to do some more stuff. So you see here. So in this case, I mentioned the flex grow, which is the factor we used when we have more available space. But when we have negative available space, so this case, it starts to play the other value that we saw for the flex property here. So for this orange, you can see that it's not like shrinking. The other elements are, but the orange doesn't. And this is because I put 0 in the factor for the shrink. If I make 1, all of them are going to shrink proportionally. Or I can use another factor. I mean, 1 is not the only allo. I can use 5. So it's going to shrink 5 times faster.
Oh, right.
Right?
Very nice.
Mind blowing. This is why I mentioned that for me it was like a deal breaker when I learned this. When I finally got into learning this, you get a lot more of speed when starting from scratch on a project. Even though that you have tools like Bootstrap or whatever you use regularly, if you do this from scratch, like for a particular project makes a big difference. Let me see. So actually this is how Flexbox came out of the box, and this works in only one direction. Most of the layouts we have like headers, content, and we have this direction, this direction. This is something that Flexbox doesn't handle. I mean, each container can only handle one direction. If we want to have two directions, we need two different containers. They can be nested. So this is when creativity starts to play. So if we have to have something with columns and rows, we will start adding different containers and laying out differently. And the main property to work with horizontal and vertically is flex direction, which by default, I didn't mention before because this is the default value, is row. So everything is going to lay out in the row direction. But we can make this column. Oops. Well, it doesn't work here. We have these things. We need to change some things around in order to work. But this is the property that we need to work with. So let's change the stretch. Let's take this off. So basically, we can do exactly the same, but in the column direction. Okay. If any of you is interested on learning something more about Flexbox, so we have, this is the noun issues. There are a couple. There are also some polyfills that you can use with CSS and also with post CSS. With post CSS, you can add a plugin that is going to translate your Flexbox code into more compatible code. It also covers some of the first draft of the Flexbox. Some versions of Internet Explorer, I don't remember if Internet Explorer, but some browsers implement an old draft, which is similar, but the properties change, property names change a bit. So these plugins help you cover those cases. And some resources, then you can, if you want to see the resources I use for this talk and the article that I created for Toptal, most of the things I took them from here. Mainly from the W3C draft, which I did not put here. So it's very easy if you want to find it. W3C Flexbox in Google. So this is what I already mentioned before. So CSS is, I think if you compare to the amount of tokens that you will have in a programming language, CSS has an insane amount of tokens. So it's a complicated language because it requires you to have a lot of memory. And sometimes you end up forgetting most of the things. So using a cheat sheet for getting started until you do the same thing like 1 million times, it will work.
It doesn't have any impact on performance against regular CSS?
Flexbox? I'm not sure. I don't know. I didn't study Flexbox in that way.
You're working with space and making
Should be. I'm guessing that it should be even faster because it doesn't. It sometimes doesn't need to recalculate the other elements because it's like available space aware. So just change the element for rendering and that's it. But I'm not sure. I guess it depends on the sort of layout you are doing and the kind of things that, yeah, that's everything. But it's a good question for the next talk. Okay, so let's take a break and have a couple of beers. So now we are going to solve the same sort of problems, but using a whole different draft from the W3C. This draft is something really new. Like 6 months ago, nobody was talking about this, and right now, if you go to the web and start searching, you'll see that couple of articles and people is starting to talk about this. And this is also inspired on something that Microsoft did a few years ago for the Metro apps. For Metro apps, we're using this a lot. A few years ago, I don't know if this is still something that it's part of Microsoft yet, but they like created the first versions. Actually, the draft has been maintained mainly by Microsoft, which is weird and makes me feel confused. But it's good to have something new. Like, if you read my article, I did this comment that I made here, which it's not something like completely new or either revolutionary, but either they were strictly compliant with the HTML5 principle, which is let's pave the go path, right? So they did not invent anything new. They just made it part of the standard. People were doing like grid layout for a lot of time. So I know we have 960 from like I don't know when, 10 years probably. It has 10 years or 5 years or something like that. And it's what designers likes to work with. It's something that it's been in the printing world for forever. People doing printing design are using grids. So it's pretty natural to have this as part of the CSS standards. And it's also very interesting, and it scales pretty well. It will allow us, basically it's oriented for solving big layouts in a page, but it can also be used for small things, like the example we are working with. And so let's see how we get this exercise working. As I mentioned before, when you are starting to learn something new in CSS, you will have your cheat sheet. I have mine here. There are a lot of new properties, and some of them I don't remember. So again, let's comment this code out. Let's start over. Again, we are going to define a grid container using the display property. This seems to be pretty standard. One comment, for this to work, actually we need to tweak some settings in the Chrome browser because it's not enabled by default, so it won't work on a regular browser. You have to go to Chrome flags, there you go, and then search for text. So you have to enable this feature here. I am already have it. But if you do that,
Can
then
you zoom in?
oh.
That's okay.
So you will see I think I made a comment over here. I don't know, somewhere. Okay, so I just made the grid, and the idea behind this draft is that we can outline a grid in our grid container, and then we can place the elements in different parts of it. The interesting part is that this draft is not static. It also is space, available space aware, and they introduced a new unit which is basically the same that we use for the Flexbox, but Flexbox just use a number, doesn't have a unit. For the grid layout, we will have the FR, which refers to, let me check and remember the name. Flexible length, they call it flexible length, that's why the FR unit. And so, this is also a major improvement because CSS grids that we are using like Bootstrap doesn't know about available space. So the upcoming frameworks and libraries that we are going to see are going to be much more powerful than what we have now once these sort of frameworks are, this sort of technology get to most of the browser. As I mentioned right now, Chrome, Firefox, I don't know, I think Safari, let's check that. But this is the compatibility table. This is what Flexbox looks like 4 years ago. So eventually this is going to get to the market. So this is why I'm talking about this topic, because I think it's very important to have an idea of what's coming next and don't lose the track, because it can happen. I mean, you can get with the classic CSS, solve the same sort of problems, but again, you are wasting a lot of time, and eventually this will make a difference. And I think most of these features, as I mentioned, are going to be basically used on frameworks and libraries. So to understand this draft, we need to see this sort of graphics. We see a very basic layout with 2 columns and 3 rows. So the idea is that we are going to be able to say, this is probably different to Bootstrap or that sort of libraries, because here we are not defining where we want to have line 1 and line 2. Instead of that, we are going to say how big we want the space between those 2 lines to be. So this will allow us to use like available space. So forget about saying line 1 is at this position. We are going to say column 1 has this width, okay? Or behave in this way. So I just placed the display grid, which will enable the grid layout for a container. You can see here, it doesn't do anything yet because we haven't yet defined the grid, either placed the elements in the grid. So what I'm going to do now is define our grid. So our grid is going to have 3 columns. So it's something really new. Sublime doesn't understand the syntax yet. So as I mentioned before, we are going to be setting the width of the columns. So when we are going to say, we have, for the first example that we did before, we have three fruits, one next to the other. So I'm going to say, I want the width of this column to be 10 EMs. The next value I place is the space between 2 lines. In this graphic here, we don't have it. We have a distance of 0, which represents our example. So I'm going to place 0. This will be like the gutter between two columns. And then we will have the other block, 10 EMs, another gutter, and 10 EMs. So this defines our grid. Yeah, I'm pretty much sure that it's not doing anything yet, barely nothing. This is not what we wanted, but let's see how it works. So now individually we're going to say which element where we want it to be placed. So I forgot about this. So we want this, and this, I mentioned before that we set here the width of the columns. When we say to an element on where we want it to place, we need to say, I want you to go from this line to this other line. So if we say our first column has 10 EMs, it defines 2 lines, as you see here. So we have line 1, line 2, right? Then we will have a gutter, line 3, and line 4. In this case, because we don't have a gutter, actually they used like the same convention, but in order to make this more scalable, let's use the lines that exist between line 2 and line 3, okay? So between the gutter. We're going to use your imagination and consider that this case has a gutter. This is the syntax. I know this is for people doing CSS, this can sound like weird, but it's a good way to say positions. Sorry, true. And actually, this is a shorthand. The longhand property will be grid columns start or something like that. I don't remember exactly. I always use it this way. It's easier this way. So for the second element, we are going to say we want to start on line 3. Remember I mentioned before about the gutters. And to end on line 4. For this element, okay? Cross fingers. Double check this. Yeah, that's it. I have an extra S. And there you go. Sorry about that, as I mentioned before, I'm not used to do this. It's just very experimental, so getting familiar with all the properties is the same problem with the memory I mentioned before. So I try to keep my memory for other important things. Okay, so this is the third example. Again, this is really easy. I can mention one problem this has, which is scalability. If you think that eventually this grid is going to grow and you are going to be adding stuff or things are going to change, using number, it's not a good idea because you are going to have to change a lot of places. But these smart people consider this case and they add named columns. I don't cover this in this talk, but if you read the article I read for Toptal, you can find that there. And it's much more easy because you don't have to like use a number. You can use just a reference, and it's sort of like a variable. You can change that in the container, and it's much more easier to maintain. So this seemed to work. As I mentioned before, like if we now want to, let's see the examples. Oops. If we now want to achieve the second, I mentioned before we have a new unit which is available space aware, and it's going to make our life extremely simple. So we can use that unit here. So what I'm changing here is really important. I mentioned before the gutters. I place 0 because I want things to be one next to the other. But what I'm going to do is like use the fraction here. So between the element in the middle, I'm going to say I want a gutter that uses one fraction of the available space. So I do the same in both. This is similar to what we do in CSS when we have a fixed width and we put margin auto. Basically the same. So we are saying that the space between columns to take available space. And it works. It's pretty straightforward. And again, it's just a matter of changing a very basic property.
We see what happens when you resize the screen. How does it break?
So to illustrate this, I use the fraction, but that gutter can take anything like. So I'm going to have one fixed and the other using available space. And again, it doesn't break when you do responsiveness, but it does break here, like because the box has a fixed width. But it doesn't basically, we can fix this for responsiveness. So all these techniques, like Flexbox and Grid, are very responsive design friendly. We basically, we need media queries much for very extreme cases. Like most of the things you can do without media queries using this draft. They are designed for this. So okay, is it clear? Do you have any questions? Okay, so let's see the other examples. As you can think, this is going to be straightforward also. So for this case, I'm going to revert. So let's keep the zeros for the gutters. And straightforward.
It looks very much like tables. What happens when you want to hide things because you're going below a much smaller resolution? For example, do you want to hide specific elements so that the other ones can fit on the screen?
Yeah, you can use the auto.
Mm-hmm.
If you have like an element, one of the boxes, I'm using fixed width for the boxes, but if something there can change, you can place a column to have the auto value. You don't need to specify it like a fixed width. I'm using like fixed, but you don't need that.
Okay.
So this will be a good example, I think.
I think that what he was asking was the difference between media queries and this approach. If you need to hide elements, like for example, a media query for less than 480 pixels, that you will hide.
No, you will use media queries.
Yes, I know, but perhaps the question is, eventually when you get to very small resolution, you want to span. For example, like in the old model, table model, you want to span so that a container that is important enough shows
the classic example, you have two columns and you want this.
Exactly.
Then you will use a media query and change this property. Instead of using 1 to 2, you will use 1 to 6.
Switch to another
you need to
table
do that.
configuration.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like I don't have like a lot of cases using this. I think that it does solve a lot of problems, mostly for big layouts. But when you start going to responsive. It has some things like using the auto and the FR, but you still need media queries much more than what you do with Flexbox. But this is not like a replacement for classic CSS and media query. It's like you will end up using the wall combination. But I can tell that you can solve a lot more problems without media query using this both draft than with classic CSS. So I was trying to make. I see what the problem is. So I'm going to make this column to use one fraction. So I wanted the center column to expand. So I just did it, and it did not work, but it actually did work. You can see that we have the apple and the kiwi in the left, in the right and the left, but this element it's sort of not working. But this is just because I have a fixed width in the elements. So again, this is straightforward. We just changed one property.
That's one thing we should take in mind. This is a grid, so this is not the actual element spanning or something. So if we are setting a grid, we also have to set the element to adapt properly to that grid. So that's why we should remove that width.
Yeah, this is
The elements span 100%, so we don't actually need to.
Another important feature this grids have is the ability to have auto columns, like we have auto widths
With stuff, we can have auto columns. So it's not that fixed as we can think on a grid. So columns can change, and everything is going to work. For instance, let's save this, and let's do another example. Okay. So what I want to do now is having the ability. Consider this case. If I want this width to be different, look this. Oops. Probably, but you cannot see that because I changed the width. Yes, you can see that. And the element is like 2 times bigger, but it's going like behind the other element. So you can, the first thing that you will think is this doesn't scale. It doesn't work. If I change something, an element, I change something on an element, the other stuff is working, I have to change the grid, and it just looks like classic CSS, but it actually doesn't. We can change this, for instance, as I did before, and change the width to have 20 amps. And what I am going to do is like allow this column to take an automatic value. So it's going to set the line to the specified width of its content. So let's do that. It works. So now the columns and everything else is working because the reference is a line, not a width, or it's just the layout keeps working. So this makes big layouts and project that tends to change much more maintainable and cleaner code. We have centralized one place for the grid. Consider that we are achieving here in one line what probably Bootstrap achieves in 100, I don't know, or something like that.
Can you please increase the viewport size to see how elements adapt?
Yep.
Thank you.
So this case, like we still have a fixed width here, but for this one is taking all the available space. So when we don't have available space, it's going to break. We can also set a classical.
What happens if the apple has a person with, like, I don't know, 10%? It would adapt?
Yep. I don't know. Let's try it.
And it doesn't work.
It takes auto.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Even better than this. That's a good question for the next talk. I'm going to be able to respond to that one. Okay, so the only...
Maybe we can use these sort of tricks to hide things without the use of media queries, like he was asking.
Probably. Hide, but I mean, we will still have the same issue. This is like, you definitely need to change. With this layout, you will need to use media queries much more than what you would do with Classic. And for this, but for those sort of things, for Classic and Flexbox, I think.
Okay.
I would like actually to have to solve like production problem with this draft to understand what the challenge is for the responsiveness, because I haven't yet. Okay, so we have solved basically all the cases. We have this one. We've seen that our grid is one dimension, which has defined columns. We can also define rows. I'm going to do so now. So for this case, I'm going to do something very simple, which is well, the property is basically the same, but it's called rows. And the same as we defined the lines in this direction, we're going to define in this direction. So I'm going to say I want one column to have, what was it?
Is there a way to use these columns like a fluid system?
Like
if you
what?
don't specify the column that you're using, and then you add media queries to the grid template columns, so that elements will drop.
Yeah, that's why it's good to use the named columns, because in that case you can, if you know how your design should work for different viewports, so you can name the columns in a way that will make sense for all of them.
Okay.
And then, like when you shrink, you just change that property with media query, and
That's it.
magic. That's much more powerful than classic CSS, because you basically can sort things wherever you like. I am trying to remember how I have to solve this. I think this is it. So basically what I want is in this example I have 3, but I will have just 1, and I want the elements to expand. So I'm going to use this is very similar, but instead of defining the rows, I'm going to the columns, I'm going to define the rows, and here I'm going to do the same. But for all of them, we are going to have the same property. So what I basically going to do is make it to the parent, so it applies to everyone. Let's
spell row.
Thank you. And let's cross fingers, and let's see how it works. Should work. I probably need to remove the height. Let's keep this in code.
Shouldn't you remove the 0? It's only one row.
No, it should have 2 lines. I probably am doing something wrong over here. I forgot the height. Yep. But there you go. So I forgot to add the height here.
So if we want to illustrate a more complex scenario, like we can add one more column here that has another one fraction. So we are going to split the vertical direction in two. And I'm going to just make the orange to use so we need to change. This is the problem with this sort of thing. So now, as I added one more, we will have this, right? So if I want to make one of them to use all the height, I need to start counting. I have two columns, so I have 2 lines and 2 lines. So I'm going to place this from 1 to 4, and the orange is going to occupy the full height. Yeah, sorry. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is basically all. This draft has a couple more features. I haven't tried them all. This is basically what you will use. The other is the naming columns and a couple of other things. But basically, what we cover, which are auto columns and fraction, it's what you will be using most of the times. Any questions? You cannot ask anything. Questions, comments?
What if,
Feel free to. I mean, even though I'm some sort of expert in CSS, these are really new things, and please have in mind that understanding these drafts are not easy. It takes me a lot of time, so probably I haven't covered something important. Or if you know anything, please feel free to collaborate.
I think that maybe this will work fine for static layouts. But for dynamic layouts, I think that there are too many magic numbers for the row number and column numbers.
That whole problem disappears when you use name and colors, basically.
But for rows?
No, it's the same. Yeah.
That's the only thing that I think
I'm
we
not
are.
fully convinced. I think that it will solve a lot of problems, but we'll add new ones. Definitely. Yeah. So we were talking with you, Diego, and what we think that eventually in the future, when this is working on the browsers, like I think that we will probably be using this and flexbox, the combination of both, and that will make a lot of sense.
Also, the time most browsers support it, probably a lot of people will feed your functions in SAS or whatever pre-compiler CSS to create more functionality, probably more readable and easier to implement. Right now it's very green, it's so alpha, so it's something that we are not used to, it's different, and it's normal that we feel probably it's harsh right now.
Yep. And this is definitely going to change in the couple of upcoming years, as Flexbox did. As mentioned, we have 2 versions of Flexbox, and this is going to change. You already see this. This is the compatibility, which is bad. The ones with the number here means basically that you need to enable a property, but it works. So Internet Explorer is the main maintainer of this draft, so they are like supporting this by default. And there you have a couple of resources. The first one is my article here, which is basically the same. I talked today, but writing. The draft, this time I did not forget. And this article is something Mozilla wrote that I think it's pretty easy to understand. So, thanks to my friend Picante, I heard about PostCSS about 2 months ago. I didn't have any clue about what it was. I am not sure about. I don't think what I'm going to say is true, but it's part of the React trend, I think, because it allows you to like working with any sort of files. Like you can add a plugin to parse inline JavaScript, inline CSS. It's pretty flexible. Basically, this is a
node package that you can grab in Gulp, Grunt, or any other build system. I use Gulp for these exercises. Basically, what it does, it takes CSS files and expose you a DOM tree of the CSS and an API, which is all a developer needs for doing magic things to CSS, right? So basically, it converts your CSS into JavaScript. So you can do whatever you like. There are a lot of very interesting plugins in the web, including one I did by myself. You can, we are going to see a couple of them, but I'm not sure what is going to happen with this, but I think it's eventually, it can become in some sort of replacement for the actual compilers of pre-processors like SAS or less. For instance, right now, to compile SAS, you need to install Ruby, and some people don't want to do that. Yeah?
You have libsas, which is a C quotation.
Yeah.
Which is fast, very fast.
Yeah, actually, if you read the PostCSS web page, they claim PostCSS is 2 times faster than libsas. Yeah, and even though that libsas is C, right? C, they claim this is 2 times faster to do the same things. I don't know how they measure it. I didn't do that myself, so that's what the PostCSS guy claims. And it's pretty much different. CSS is just a preprocessor. This is a post-processor. It grabs anything, writing in something like CSS, and you return anything you like. So having that said, for just a CSS developer, this seems like too much because you need JavaScript. But you can use PostCSS just using plugins. It's a matter of just adding them in the pipe for the full, and it will work. But you can also, as I mentioned, write yourself plugins. And for this talk, I created one, which I wanted to show you. But let's take a look on how a Gulp file looks, which uses PostCSS. So let's see the package. If any one of you is familiar, I guess everyone is familiar with now. No? Well, now this, like, you can explain this better, but it's JavaScript running in a server. And what I did here is install a couple of dependencies like Gulp, PostCSS, which is the package that I need for this to work, and the Gulp, sorry, the PostCSS package and the Gulp wrapper for PostCSS to work with, for this to work with Gulp. And this is a very basic configuration. I'm saying to Gulp that the default task is going to this is redundant. The Gulp task is going to grab some CSS files and it's going to watch them. So it's going to like rerun this task every time a CSS file changes. And what I did here is like commented this code out, but these basically are CSS and PostCSS plugins. As I mentioned before, this I created one for this talk, which is called Shades of Gray. Shades of Gray.
Not 50.
No, not 50. Just shades. Just shades. What this plugins is to illustrate the power of PostCSS. What this plugin does is you provide an array, a JavaScript array of gray colors, and it will parse the CSS, and it will replace any gray to the closest. Okay? So the idea is that avoiding adding gray colors that are not in the guidelines. So you take the design guideline, you use those grays, and this plugin is just going to use the closest. So you don't either have to worry about picking the right color, you just use a similar one and the plugin is
doing the rest. So let's try to make it work. So I'm going to enable the shades. As I mentioned before, I have this installed here in the package.json, so when I run npm install, this is going to install all dependencies, and this package I created is in the npm repository, so it's going to install. And I'm going to also do a very basic CSS to illustrate this. So let's say
try 54, 54, 54.
Okay, let's try this one. Let me double check this. So this is the array I'm passing. I have white and black in the two corners, and then I have BBB and 444 as the only grays I want in my project. So let's see how the plugin works. I need to restart this. Okay, so let's see if it works. Okay, so I made it to use, I wanted this to have, oh, where is it? I place this, but the plugin is automatically searching for the closest, and the output is going to use the closest, which is 44444. Very simple, and this I think illustrates pretty well what PostCSS is aimed for. I'm going to show you the code now for how the plugin works. Where is it? Okay. So this is 80 line of code JavaScript, which has some code that it's basically copy paste. Yeah, I mean converting there are a couple of conversion of colors. The base trick for this plugin is that understanding that grays, all gray, if it's a pure gray, RGB are equals. All the three values are equal. So this is what makes the plugin work. So I can detect if let's see the code here. So this is the API I mentioned. This is the actual plugin. The other are helper functions. So what I receive here, when the plugin runs, it receives a DOM tree, which represents the CSS. This is one of the most used APIs that the PostCSS offer, which is walkDex. It's going to loop over all CSS declarations. And basically what I'm doing here is using a regular expression to match whenever a color is in the value of that property. If that happens, I assume that can have one property, which is, I don't know if this is true, but a CSS property can take two colors. I think this is not true, but I'll make it this way just in case something changes in the future. So it has more than one. It's going to loop every color, and then it's going to test if it's a gray, and if it's a gray, then it's going to replace with the closest color. Basically, even though we have a lot of code, most of the code is for converting colors into different representations to see if a color is a gray and that sort of thing that are more related to JavaScript and CSS. The actual plugin code uses just 15 lines of code, and it gives you an insane amount of control over what you can do with CSS. So if you go to the PostCSS homepage, you'll see they show here a lot of plugins. They have a lot. These are community driven. They are not being developed. Most of them, they are not being developed by the PostCSS guys. So this really active community, I see a great future for this. Like, for instance, I mentioned there is some stuff for Flexbox. Let's look. So this one will grab the CSS you wrote and make it remove the bugs. So this is the sort of thing that we are going to be seeing right now, coming next. Like things that will grab your CSS and make it better, or fix it, or lint, or a lot of hours and things for CSS. This is a huge tool for like working with the future. Any questions? Okay. Again, some resources. This is a Breaking Up with SAS. It's a great article that illustrates the plugins that you need if you want to move out from SAS and start only using Post CSS. The good thing is that you can keep using both. You can still have your SAS and pipe the result of building SAS to Post CSS and do whatever you want. So this is the overall conclusion for the talk. Thank you very much to all of you to assisting here. I'm very happy. CSS is something I really love doing. I've met few people in the world that really likes doing CSS. So I know for you this is like a huge effort. Again, so thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. And this is all. If you have any questions, feel free or ping me whenever you want.
You said it once, CSS is not meant for engineers.
Yeah, actually that's right. CSS, just to make it clear, I should have said this in the beginning of the talk. CSS is not a programming language. CSS is a presentation language. So everything that you have experience with, like programming, it's not applicable for CSS.
Two different concepts.
It's two different concepts. People like SAS started to add logic to CSS, which I sucks. In 10 years doing CSS, I haven't even yet found the need to use logic in the presentation layer. Most of the things that cannot be solved without logic, it's because CSS was this, like, it's what we have. It's not designed for like layout, complex layout. And that's it. Thank you.